Hi y'all. Thank you for your continued interest in my research presentation, The War on Drugs, Prisoners of War in the Homeland. I am Maggie Schrage, an honor student and presidential scholar at Millikan University, where I double major in political science and philosophy, with the intention of attending law school after graduation. I gained interest in the war on drugs while in a criminal justice class that I attended for my majors. I knew I had to further my own research on the topic when I learned of the legislation that was written into law in the era that was intentionally targeting African Americans in America. It led to the mass incarceration that is still evident today. I became interested in the pipeline that portrayed drug users, specifically those that are African American, as hardened criminals worthy of harsh prison sentences. The legislation that intentionally oppressed minorities in America led me to conduct my own research on the era of hyperincarceration. I feel that it is important for me to study it in the case that I get to impact legislation in my future career in law and politics. A brief abstract of my paper includes: while the famous war on drugs in America gained notoriety during the Reagan era, it first came into light in the early 70s under the Nixon administration and continued through the Carter, Reagan, and Bush presidencies. The phrase was coined when recreational drug use became quite abundant for the first time, and the United States government took great measures to try and lock up dealers and users alike. While diving into the facts and effects of the proposition, a racial divide was created within the U.S., specifically between communities of color and their distrust of the government. The half-hearted attempts to deter or eliminate illegal drug use in this country caused more harm than good and ultimately negatively impacted the United States as a whole. This effect became widely evident and proved that the war on drugs was more specifically a war on people of color, yielding prisoners of war in their own homeland. With the origin point being 1971, just 52 years ago from 2023, the drug war isn't old history to be forgotten about. It is nearly still on our doorstep, with legislation that was written as a tax in the era still in effect today. The long-winded drug war all began at the hands of President Richard Nixon in 1971 when he declared a war on drugs and moved his executive targets to combating substance abuse. He became the first president to adamantly propose mandatory prison sentences for such possessions of drugs. To support this effort, he created the DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration Agency, that dedicated funding to policing the drug trade and drug consumption within the U.S. Though he claimed his intent was to attack drugs rather than its users, it became wildly evident he had ulterior motives some years later. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, proposed controversial statements to the public that included: the Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, and even more transparently stated, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. He went on to add, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. His statements expressing their pure intent on the legislation of the drug war directly exposed the oppression-based backgrounds that first took off in the creation of the war on drugs and continues into the current day when many African Americans are still fighting for equal opportunity to avoid unjust sentences and incarceration. Beginning in 1977, the war on drugs had been halted briefly for the duration of Jimmy Carter's presidency because he did not prioritize drug use as a massive controversy like Nixon believed it to be. Part of his campaign for presidency promised Americans his honest attempt to legalize marijuana, but his ideas never made it down on paper to the Senate or the House of Representatives. He did aid the American public by not passing any new laws against drug use. However, in 1986, the drug war and legislation for it caught wind again. As the newest presidential-elect took office in 1986, Ronald Reagan spoke to the world and began his own journey to fight the war on drugs within the borders of the United States of America. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was signed into legislation just a few short weeks following his first embark on the issue. It was the first legislation to establish mandatory minimum sentences and the possible denial of bail and parole for those found guilty of violating laws and probation terms. These new minimum sentences were created for drug possession, which in turn increased penalties to long sentences behind bars for petty drug offenses. The intention behind the different mandatory minimums was to lock up large-scale drug dealers, but instead it mostly affected poor users and small dealers. This then led to major racial and class imbalances, where users of virtually the same drugs were punished very differently. Additionally, Reagan introduced the controversial three-strike laws to the United States. It locked up criminals for life sentences after being arrested and found guilty on their third conviction of violating any law written into legislation. While this may seem like a fair attempt at keeping tough criminals off the streets, it often affected normal Americans more than true repeat offenders who were serious threats to society. Regardless of the severity of the crime, misdemeanor, or felony, people were thrown behind bars for the entirety of their lives. This legislation was meant to be tough on crime, but actually increased the incarceration rates in the U.S. and placed misdemeanors at the same level of punishment as felonies. Along Reagan's side stood his wife, Nancy, who herself led the Just Say No campaign to deter youth from drugs by bringing the dangers of drug use to light. She traveled the country appearing to children in schools, TV and radio stations, rehab centers, and most importantly, anti-drug rallies. Nancy's campaign, although it was pure in intent, labeled addicts as people who were unable to resist peer pressure. She believed that addiction could be voided with a simple no. Even though it gained a surplus of media attention and framed the First Lady's impact in office, her campaign, quote-unquote, grossly simplified the solution to decreasing adolescent drug use and was shown to be largely an effective form of preventive education, according to Policing and Social Justice History Lab. While avoiding the true reason drugs were used for the public, and especially in the areas of low economic prosperity, little deterrence was enacted. As more government expenditures were focused on fighting drug distribution of crack cocaine, which was preferred among users of low socioeconomic statuses, it was criminalized and penalized much more than the quote-unquote prestigious and expensive powdered cocaine. This powdered version of cocaine was favorable to users, specifically white Americans, in middle and upper socioeconomic classes. This attack on cocaine users affected predominantly people of color due to the quote-unquote 1986 bill that created minimum sentencing laws with a 100-to-1 disparity between powder and crack cocaine, supported by untrue claims that crack is more dangerous and addictive, while there is pharmaceutically no difference in effects between the two forms. This means that someone convicted of a possession of powder cocaine would have to have 100 times the amount of crack cocaine to receive the exact same mandatory minimum sentence. With this in mind, the judge of the case is still at the discretion to decide if the minimum is enough time to serve or if the additional time is necessary, and racial biases can play a major factor into it as well. Because of this, minorities and people of lower economic standings were punished much more harshly than those who could afford the quote-unquote good stuff, and powder users were exempt from negative portrayal and excessive policing. Moreover, the academic journal Impossible Criminals, The Suburban Imperatives Americans War on Drugs, expressed how the image of wealthy white teenage drug users were framed to be seen as, quote-unquote, innocent victims who must be shielded from both the illegal drug markets and the criminal drug laws. He stated how studies prior to 2015 confirmed that urban and suburban white teenagers sell and consume illegal drugs at nearly identical rates as their African American counterparts, and that inner city black residents are disproportionately arrested and incarcerated for violations including marijuana, the long and most popular recreational drug among affluent white youth. The societal belief that less white American consumption of drugs compared to black Americans intentionally led to less policing of white drug users due to societal's quote-unquote rankings of the people within the group consuming the product. Moreover, even though marijuana was known to be favored among white, young Americans, black Americans often took the fall, and this led to massive disproportionate incarceration rates around drug use. Just 2 short years later, the Anti-Drug Use Act of 1988 was signed into action. In the grand view of things, it was essentially the same thing as the prior act, but had enhanced penalties for harsher punishments, such as life sentences behind bars for a drug possession that still mainly impacted people of color. With this new addition to legislation, if drug offenders were not already behind bars on their third strike, they were sure to be in the running for the same punishment as those who were. As people started to see the true intentions of the legislation that was getting tougher and tougher on offenders, communities of color relied less and less on the justice system that only abused them. When the distrust became apparent to the world, there were no options to rebuild the relationship that was never there. The greater policing of illegal drugs in low-income areas and communities of color created and allocated for violence and distrust in the system that it is supposed to protect. History.com stated, "The war on drugs fosters the racial over-policing of minority communities, which feeds the school-to-prison pipeline. This proves that the cycle of distrust in the justice system continues generationally due to the fact that minorities are less likely to comply with the justice system because it statistically throws them behind bars more than their white counterparts." With legal punishments for drug offenses becoming harsher and harsher for African Americans, the question of who will fight for equal opportunities in the criminal justice system arose. The usual hardships that African Americans in low socioeconomic statuses face include housing disparities, access to welfare programs, representation in government, employment, and access to fair education did not waver. With acknowledgement of the drug problem in youth, he focused his attention to the fact that the attacks were on communities of color specifically. His line, "As the war on Iraq does, so too the supposed war on drugs will mean a disproportionate share of African American youth being killed or incarcerated," which outlined exactly the similarities between an actual war and bloodshed of our own citizens at the hand of the system that is supposed to serve and protect its people. He felt that President Bush's attempt to fighting crime was a continued effort to attempt to starve off the potential dominance of the world's people of color from his prior predecessors. Crosby wraps up his publication of research by stating, quote unquote, "Our job will be to remove the ambiguities, the illusions, to see the major and subordinate issues clearly, and to move using all means necessary to eliminate them and restore the African American nation to its rightful place among humankind." His obvious efforts to bring justice to Black Americans highlighted how the war affected communities of color back in the 90s, and comparatively, it has changed very little to today in 2023. Although Jim Crow laws have been outlawed from legislation since the mid-1960s, their effects are still alive and well in American society. According to author Graham Boyd, up to 2001, the number of Black men in prisons was the same amount of Black men enslaved in America in 1820. By 2016, there were the same amount of African American men in prisons as there were slaves in 1860, the year of the largest number of enslaved people of all American history. Applying the later Jim Crow laws to the drug war, Boyd states, "Jim Crow pretended that separate but equal treatment sufficed, even as blacks faced daily lynching and every form of overt discrimination. The drug war claims morality and protection of children as its goals, while turning a blind eye to the racial injustice it promotes. Though Jim Crow laws have been long terminated, there is continued legislation that is purposeful in discriminating against African Americans in the United States." Author Frank Rudy Cooper discussed racial profiling surrounding the drug war by opening up with the impactful quote, "The possibility of being imprisoned has become fundamental to Black masculine subjectivity." He states that it has become common sense for African American men to be seen as threats that need to be behind bars. This is at fault of political parties, politicians, lobbyists, institutions, special interest groups, and other groups who have used and continue to use the media to normalize this stereotype. This is evident in the creation of the war on drugs, where President Reagan pushed for stronger punishments for drug offenses, while at the time, Cooper reports, only 2% of Americans believed it to be a major issue, and it thus appears that Reagan was not responding to a popular concern, but creating one through the demonization of drug users. Moreover, in society, marijuana is seen as a quote-unquote black drug by the media, possibly because of the significance of it in rap songs. This elaborates further how the media can give a negative connotation and use that idea to stigmatize a whole race of people. Another example of the media stigmatizing Black men sprouted during the era of Jim Crow, when African American men were presumed to be rapists who were a constant threat to white women. This instilled generational fears of African American men to be untrustworthy and a possible danger, which fed into the strength of the era of white supremacy. With this in mind, this allowed for police to patrol communities of color much more thoroughly in attempts to get unreasonably target Black American drug users off the street without addressing white American drug use. This has normalized the idea that In order to overcome the presumption that he is a bad black man, a black man must bring forth evidence that he is instead a good black man. By doing this, the black man must, quote-unquote, prove to the world that they deny their black culture and embrace the culture of norm, mass incarceration of African American men. This normalized action clearly expressed how the war on drugs is actually a war on black Americans. The executive system in place is yet to achieve its goal and defeat drug abuse, so changes must be made sooner or later at the source of the legislation. It is important in today's age to respond to what American citizens believe, that being that 2 out of every 3rd person believes that it is time that cannabis is legalized in the United States. With prisons being, quote-unquote, as ineffective as they are inefficient, the only way to rebuild the system is to actually fight drug use rather than sending users to life behind bars. This would have to include scraping long punishments behind bars and turning the focus onto the goal of rehabilitation of users. After drug users are released from prison after doing their time, 2/3 of those offenders will re-offend in the first 5 years of the release and end up directly right back where they were. This large recidivism rate keeps people on a leash held by the incarceration system rather than reaching the goal of reforming the individual. If people are provided a rehab system that could keep them away from drugs, repeat offending rates would fall dramatically. Though this would create comparably worlds of difference in success rates, the implication could take years, and the trust between the system and communities of color would take generations from now to fabricate once again. With it being reported that 1 in 9 African American children experience the absence of at least one parent in their life due to incarceration, future generations of Americans from all races deserve to not have to fear the government and police. Additionally, once a person is released from prison, regaining access to resources that are often denied to those who have a criminal record rarely allows for a seamless transition back into society. As youth in America witnesses the impact that this has on their parents and other adults around them, they become more distrustful and desire to lack reliance on a government that only seems to oppress them. This obviously furthers the divide between trust in the system and those of all races who have gone through it all while introducing the next generation to the same belief systems. All in all, it is important to understand that the war on drugs was a disguised attack on minorities within the United States by those with absolute power. With the drug crisis in America starting in the 1970s and still raging on in the current day, it is still a very valid and serious epidemic, but those in power abuse their leverage to oppress a distinctive group. It is time that the justice system be rebuilt on principles that actually reflect the people's constitutional rights. The American people deserve to be victorious over the war on drugs, but not at the cost of the basic freedoms of our most vulnerable citizens. Thank you again for tuning into the audio version of my research about the war on drugs. I hope that my passion for justice impacted you enough to use your voice and constitutional right to vote to aid in the creation of legislation that creates a fair America for you, me, and all future generations. Thank you again.